The subject matter, as Dory described, and I share this with him, is a crucial subject matter. Incitement for terrorism is a crucial and neglected subject matter. In the peace accords, or the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and the Fatah organization, which is known under the name the Oslo process, at least in the midst of the process, Israel insisted, and the two sides agreed that there is a need to deal with incitement, and therefore they created a trilateral committee for monitoring incitement. It was under Bibi Netanyahu in his first term, and actually the one who was responsible for that was Ariel Sharon as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I was privileged to be a member of this trilateral committee. There are other colleagues of mine that I saw in the list of speakers today. But I also had the pleasure to be involved in these meetings of the committee for a few years under two prime ministers, Bibi Netanyahu and Ehud Barak. And we can talk for hours about the way that those discussions have been conducted. But I would say, all in all, unfortunately, it was a waste of time. It was a waste of time because from the other side, there was no real intention to do anything about incitement. You would be surprised that after 3 years of discussions, we didn't even reach an agreement upon the question, what is the definition of incitement? 3 years of discussion. We traveled all over to Ramallah, Jerusalem, Washington, good food, good surrounding. We didn't agree on what is the definition of the subject matter that we are going to discuss. So it's really a difficult issue, and I think that the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs is doing a very important job in trying to contribute to clarify the importance of the subject matter and the essence of the subject matter. And I would like to contribute my share from a counterterrorism expert point of view. And for that, in the coming minutes, I will teach you a little bit counterterrorism. We are talking about definitions. I'm saying that there is no definition for incitement. But there is also no agreeable definition for the term terrorism. So, by the way, you're dealing with two subject matters that are not defined internationally. No terrorism or incitement. It's not that there are lack of definitions. There is a very good book that I would recommend to read of Alex Schmid under the name Political Violence. It was written in the 70s. And he offers 109 definitions for terrorism. So everybody holds his own definition for the term. But I would suggest my definition. I would not get into that discussion right now, but maybe in another occasion. I would say that terrorism, to put it simple, is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians, which is aimed to achieve political goals. That's what differs terrorism from, say, criminal activity. The terrorist has political goals, different types of political goals altogether. It could be nationalistic, separatistic. It could be socio-economical goals. It could be religious political goals. For example, creating a caliphate state is a religious political goal. It could be promoting extreme ideologies like communism, fascism, anarchism, and so on and so forth. But all in all, the goals, on top of being political in nature, what makes terrorism what it is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians. But terrorism is also a very dynamic phenomenon. The terrorists are all the time on a learning curve. That's what makes terrorism so interesting for me to research for more than 30 years. Because whatever we know about terrorism today, it's not necessarily the challenge that we are going to face tomorrow. They are on a learning curve, they are learning the counter-terrorist efforts, and they are changing. They are changing their modus operandi. They are changing their immediate goals, not the ultimate goals, not the root causes, but instrumental goals. And they are changing sometimes even the structure and deployment and so on and so forth. But terrorism is a certain type of a war, or a warfare if you wish. And when we are talking about the realm of a warfare, we should differ, or we should start with symmetric warfare. Symmetric warfare is a warfare, it's a war being conducted between two entities. I wouldn't say that they are equal in their power, but in their essence they are equal, meaning symmetric warfare would be a war between two states, between two armies. In a symmetric war, a war between states, you win and lose in the battlefield itself, in the military battlefield itself. It's a question of how much firepower you have, how much you succeeded to paralyze the firepower of the other side. That's the way that in classical wars you won and lost the war. But as said, this war situation, terrorism phenomenon is evolving and changing. And what we saw, I would say, from the midst of the 20th century, we saw the rise of a new breed of warfare. And this is the asymmetric warfare. The asymmetric warfare, which is a war between a state and a non-state actor, between an army and a militia, or between an army and an organization, and so on and so forth. Here you have another element that is added to the war, another battlefield. And the battlefield is the media battlefield. Here you win and lose not necessarily just by being able to paralyze the firepower of the other side. Here you might find yourself winning and losing in the media battlefield by being able to decrease the motivation of the other side by inducing fear and anxiety and hesitation, in the other side willing to keep on fighting. But I would argue that in the last few years, we are facing a third development of the modern warfare, the modern war. And here I'm talking about a war between a state. It's a certain type of an asymmetric warfare. It's a war between a state and what I refer to as a hybrid terrorist organization. I'll explain this term in a few moments. This war is focused on the question of legitimacy. The hybrid terrorist organization is trying to win the war in putting a question mark on the legitimacy of the enemy to keep on fighting. And also, he's trying to gain its own legitimacy for that. Now, if this is not complicated enough, the real challenge of fighting terrorism today, of fighting those asymmetric warfares today, is not that we now need to deal with the campaign of delegitimization of Israel or any other state that is fighting terrorism. It's not just that. It's not just that we need to fight in the battlefield of the media or still need to win the military battle itself. Don't forget about that. The real challenge is that today you need to fight simultaneously on those three arenas. And you might find yourself in a paradox in which you win the war in one arena, but then you lose the war in another arena. You win in the battlefield, in the military battlefield, but you lost in the media. You win in the media, but you lost in the international courts. That's the real challenge. And this is what I refer to as a multi-dimensional warfare. We are fighting not only in one dimension, we are fighting in multi-dimensional situation. That's the real challenge. I'll skip that. What's a hybrid terrorist organization? A hybrid terrorist organization is an organization that stands on two or, in many cases, three legs. The first leg is the classical type of a terrorist organization, which is an organization that has a military arm that conduct terrorist activity, those atrocities that we see and refer to as terrorist activity. That's what we used to see in terrorist organizations in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and so on and so forth. But the hybrid terrorist organization is trying to be active, to operate, and to win in those two worlds at the same time. The legitimate arena and maybe the illegitimate arena of conducting terrorist activity. So the hybrid terrorist organization developed a political arm. And the political arm, as we will see in a moment, is taking part in the political legitimate campaigns. Some or most of those hybrid terrorist organizations develop a third arm. And the third arm is an arm of a welfare services which they give to their constituency or potential constituencies and so on and so forth. So the hybrid terrorist organization, first and foremost, is active on the so-called legitimate arena. By offering those services to the public at large, to the potential constituency, potential supporters of the organization, they actually sow the seeds of the support that they would like to get from those people down the road. By giving those services, welfare services, and actually what we refer here is what is being known under the name dawah, which is a combination of religious services, education services, indoctrination, and welfare services. By giving this dawah activity to their potential constituency, they actually buy their hearts and minds. They give it, in most cases, free of charge or very cheap, much cheaper than what they can gain in other tracks. And in a persistent process, for a considerable period of time, we are talking about years, sometimes even decades, they buy the hearts and minds of their constituency. And then, when the time comes, they reap the seeds, or what came from those seeds, in their involvement in the political arena. So they actually construct a party, a political party, or a front party. Sometimes it's official party of the organization. In other cases, it's camouflaged. And the political party is taking part and participate in the political, legitimate, free elections. Nobody is pointing a gun necessarily. But actually they bought their hearts and minds. What do I mean by buying? They brainwashed the hearts and minds of those people, and they voluntarily, democratically voting for the fundamentalists, for the extremists, for the terrorists. And once they win a considerable power through the political process, they take over incrementally the political establishment. When they take over the political establishment, they can subordinate the resources of the entity, if it's a state or whatever it is, subordinate the resources to do what? To conduct more dawah activity, indoctrination, welfare, and so on and so forth. So it's a perpetuum mobile type of activity which creating bigger power to those elements when time flies or time goes on. That is the process, or the so-called legitimate process of the hybrid terrorist organization. This cannot be done without the support of states. And I would argue that there are three types of states which are involved in this process. I would start with a patron state. A patron state is the state in which this terrorist organization is active in their territory. If we'll take concrete example, I would refer, for example, to Hezbollah. The patron state of Hezbollah, I do not refer here to Iran, I refer here to Lebanon. Because the patron state either turn a blind eye to the activity of the terrorist organization, or even let them officially take part in the legitimate political arena. By doing that, they are paving the way for this vicious cycle to take place. Then down the road, when those terrorists have a lot of power, these patron states are coming to the international community and say, what do you want? They are too strong. We cannot deal with them. They have a huge military capability. They have a huge support by the large constituency. We cannot deal with them. So the patron state is responsible for that process. The sponsoring state is responsible for that process because in many cases, these organizations need the support of other states. My friends, you know, one of the new trends, not new, since 9/11, a lot of emphasis is being given to trace the dollar, fighting the fundraising of the terrorist organization. Well, it's definitely a very important policy and sometimes even very successful. But we need to bear in mind, to conduct a terrorist act, it's very cheap. Fighting the money would not necessarily stop the terrorist activity itself. For example, one of the recent plots that was thwarted was the printers plot. If you remember, El-Awlaki, Allah not yirachamo. El-Awlaki, the Amir, Al-Qaeda Amir in Yemen, was responsible for a plot in which he wanted to blow up few airplanes in the mid-air by using cargo, by using printers that explosives were hidden inside. Thanks God this was thwarted. But El-Awlaki gave an interview after that, and he said, you know how much this plot cost me? $4,500. It will take $1 trillion for the Americans to have the new measures, or to bring new measures, technological measures and manpower in order to deal with this new challenge that I pose to them. But terrorist organization needs a lot of money. And mainly they need the money not to conduct the terrorist act itself, but in order to buy the hearts and minds of the masses, of the supporters, in order to conduct the dawah activity. The dawah activity costs a lot of money. So this dawah activity cannot happen without, most cases, sponsoring states' support. So if we talk about Hezbollah, the sponsoring state is naturally Iran. But I would say that this is not enough. There is another element, another group of states which are involved in the process, unintentionally, unwillingly. Sometimes they don't even understand that they are involved in the process. And these are Western states from the international community. And if I need to name one state, I would say United States. Because they give the legitimization to that process. They are obsessed with the idea that democracy is a miracle solution. Just read the new book of Condoleezza Rice. B, they believe that free election represent democracy. They tend to forget that democracy is something which is much bigger, much more complicated than free elections. Democracy is first and foremost, in my view, a set of values. It's civil society, it's human rights, it's women's lib, It's the right of minorities. That's what democracy is all about. Free election, it's just an apparatus to achieve democracy. But if you offer free election, sometimes even impose free election, on people which have been brainwashed for decades, they vote for the real thing, as Coca-Cola refers to that. They vote to what they believe is the real thing. They vote for Hamas and not for Abu Mazen. And I would dare to predict, although usually I don't dare to do that, if tomorrow morning there were elections here in the Palestinian Authority, after all the international efforts, the economical reforms and so on and so forth, still Hamas would win the election. I met Condoleezza Rice in my sabbatical year at Stanford, and we had a lot of interesting talks. In one of the stories that she told me, she said about the former elections. And in the former elections, she said, she was the Secretary of State, all the intelligence community in the United States, with no exception, was convinced that Hamas is going to lose the election. There was no other voice in the intelligence community in the United States. She went to sleep that night. Here it was the morning, the night of the election. She went to sleep that night in the United States. And she woke up, she went to a trade mill, I quote her, she started to practice and she opened CNN. And she learned from the CNN news that Hamas won the election. She didn't hesitate. She took her cellular while keep on training. She called the deputy and she said, please call the CNN. They got it all wrong. They said that Hamas won the election. And he said, Mrs. Secretary, we got it wrong. But you know what? Condoleezza Rice said that she's not worried from the fact that Hamas won the elections. Why? Because democracy is stronger. Because the Palestinians will understand the mistakes that they did and they will get rid from Hamas. Not now, in the next election. Not in the next election, afterwards. Where did you see an example for such a process? When fundamentalists win free election, it's one man, one vote, one time. The only way to get rid from them is by counter-revolution, violent. No way, they will not go down voluntarily. So this is another state that actually paved the way to this process to happen. But it doesn't stop there, because I'm talking about two parallel cycles. The terrorist organization, don't forget, he's also a terrorist organization, i.e. he conducts terrorist attacks. And those terrorist attacks are aimed not just to kill, but also to provoke the enemy state to fight back. Now, when the enemy state is fighting back, the terrorist organization is trying to force the enemy state to harm and to hit civilian targets. How does they do that? By using human shields, by planting their bases, their Katyusha rockets and so on and so forth in civilian targets, in schools, in mosques, in hospitals and so on and so forth. Actually, they force the enemy side to hit civilian, sometimes even protected targets. By doing that, on top of many other things, international condemnations and so on and so forth, they also induce hatred in their own community, because their own communities see the enemy killing civilians, not intentionally, some kind of collateral damage or whatever. They do not have this observation if it's intentionally or not. They just see what happens. They don't even report to themselves who's responsible for that process, who started, who planted those places there, and so on and so forth. This is creating more incitement, more hatred. So the terrorist cycle supports the political cycle as well. When we talk about incitement, we talk about a battle on legitimacy. The terrorists, by inducing incitement, they are trying to delegitimize the enemy. But when we are talking about a hybrid terrorist organization, as I will show you in a moment, I would argue that simultaneously, it's the other flip of the coin. Simultaneously, they are trying to gain legitimacy for themselves. So when we talk about delegitimizing the enemy state, we are talking about diplomatic campaign, humanitarian campaign, legal campaign, and propaganda campaign, and so on and so forth. Who is doing that? Those which are doing that are human rights organizations, sponsoring states, charities, which in many cases are front organization of those organizations, terrorist supporters, and the international community at large. So it's a very strange mix, because I'm saying here that there are simple people, good loving people, human rights activists. Who doesn't like human rights activists? I like them. I refer to myself as a human rights activist. Any counterterrorism expert is a human rights activist, by the way. Because I heard it, you mentioned Erwin Kotler. When I was maybe second year student, Erwin Kotler told me at that time he was just a professor, was a professor at McGill University. And he told me, I am a human rights activist and I'm a counterterrorism activist. I don't see a contradiction between the two, because as a counterterrorism activist, I'm trying to see to it that people will guard their right to live. And there is no ultimate goal than the right to live. So anyone who's a counter-terrorist is first and foremost a human rights activist. But how are they being, how they work together, those elements? And I would argue that those elements actually can be and should be divided into two groups. The terrorist supporters, those which intentionally, knowingly know that they are supporting terrorists. Those Hamas supporters in the United States, Hamas supporters in Europe, they are not being misled by the propaganda of the organization. They know exactly who Hamas is, and they support them. Those are the front organizations of Hamas. Those are Palestinians and other people that support Hamas in the international arena. But there is a huge group, and excuse me for being blunt by saying what I'm saying. I'm an Israeli, I'm not politically correct person. I refer to that group as the useful idiots group, Lenin. And the useful idiots group support this organization genuinely, not because they support terrorism, not because they support Hamas, because A, they believe that this organization became a legitimate organization in the legitimate process that we have described. And B, they believe that this organization is the underdog. Now, now I shift to Israel, and I will conclude with that. We as Israel, when we are facing this multidimensional warfare, when we are facing this campaign of bashing Israel, incitement against Israel, and so on and so forth, we should not focus in dealing with those terrorist supporters. That's a lost case. We would never be able to change their mind, to influence them, to persuade them. It will never happen. But we need to focus on the useful idiots. Those are real, good, loving people. And they can learn from the factual information. They can learn from exposing the incitement messages, the insightful messages, and so on and so forth. That's the group we need to focus in when we are conducting that. So, to sum up, we are facing today a multidimensional warfare, which is a very complex campaign. In this multidimensional warfare, the terrorists and their supporters identify the weaknesses of democracies, the soft bellies of democracies, and they are misusing democratic terms, democratic slogans, democratic apparatuses to gain more power and more legitimacy. And these have led to the creation of the new breed of terrorist organization, which is the hybrid terrorist organization. The hybrid terrorist organization is a two-sided coin, which is striving for legitimacy on one hand, for themselves, and fighting and delegitimate the enemy by using incitement, by using indoctrination, by using propaganda, and so on and so forth. And it's a huge task for decision makers, and I refer international decision makers, to find ways to have an international, first of all, agreement on what the picture is. Going back to what we started in our discussion. What are the definitions? What is incitement? What is terrorism? Let's start with that. Once we would agree on that, it will be easier to have the building blocks which are needed, conventions which are needed, and so on and so forth, to conduct an effective campaign against incitement and these delegitimization campaigns. Thank you very much.